welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. I still remember feeling a eureka moment when I discovered Man-Watching by Desmond Morris on body language and studied it as part of social biology A-level. I've always been fascinated by behaviour and am a self-confessed people watcher. So today I'm thrilled to introduce you to behavioural scientist, brilliant thinker and writer Elspeth Kirkman. Elspeth is Chief Programmes Officer at Nesta, a charity originally set up with a £250 million endowment from the National Lottery to support innovation for social good and find solutions to society's biggest problems. Elspeth is the author of Behavioural Insights and the brains behind the groundbreaking book Decisionscape, The Art of Getting Perspective, published earlier this year. She's also become a sensation on TikTok with her fun self-deprecating posts, making behavioural science accessible to all of us. Elspeth, when an astronaut selector says you need to interview one of the cleverest women she knows, it has to be done, and that's you.
Yeah, I felt that she was perhaps slightly over-egging me, but very delighted to be here.
I don't think she's over-egged you at all, having done my research. Would the world be a better place, Elspeth, if we all understood a bit more about behaviour?
I certainly think so, yes. I think a lot of the ways that we've designed the world have been designed as though we know absolutely nothing about human beings, how they operate, what motivates them, and it serves us quite poorly. And I think one of the things I'm really passionate about is you can go and get a PhD in behavioural science, which I should say I haven't actually, or you can draw on the fact that all of us know a lot about human behaviour by virtue of being humans and interacting with them day in, day out. And so I think this shouldn't be a kind of protected arena that only people with PhDs can operate in.
What sparked your interest in the first place? Because it is something that, as you say, we're all human beings, but we don't really think perhaps about our behaviour very often.
So I didn't know about behavioural science as a field at all. And when I say behavioural science, there isn't a kind of tight discipline that I'm talking about. Often the research draws in lots of different fields, so sociology, economics, and psychology, anthropology, lots of these other ologies. And I basically didn't know what any of those things were when I first went off to uni. And I went and read English literature, and I always used to find that the sorts of questions I was interested in were not really the sorts of questions that English literature professors were terribly interested in. So I would kind of, be very sort of interested in trying to dissect character motivations, for example, when actually it was much more about close reading of the prose. But I think what really drew me to literature is the same thing that draws me to behavioural science, which is that it's a study of what people do, why they do it, and how that kind of plays out. And I always think that behavioural science is a set of fairly new disciplines. So a lot of the empirical research that we draw on is 50 years, 100 years old at most. But when you look back at even really old art texts, so whether it's literature or works of art, it's describing the exact same phenomena. So I think I kind of got interested in it before I knew that it had a name and what it was. And then I kind of came to it through, I was working on global pensions legislation, essentially, which sounds incredibly dull and is quite dull. But pensions are one of those areas where the importance of good decision-making and the ways that decision-making go wrong are massively front and centre, and you have to design around that if you're going to do good legislation and regulation for it. And I sort of got into it through that and suddenly found out that there was a name for this field I was really interested in.
I think it sounds great that it involves lots of ologies, because behavioural science, you're right, a lot of us perhaps don't even know what that really encompasses. But is that what really keeps you motivated, that to solve the problems which we'll look at some of in a minute that you're taking a look at, that you look at these issues from lots of different lenses, including culture and art?
Yes, exactly. And I think that the sort of motivating question or interest at the heart of behavioural science is understanding what people do and why they do it. And then the kind of next level on that, I guess, is how do you get them to do it differently? And there's lots of interesting ethical questions that you can get into on, well, who gets to say what differently should look like and what a good decision is and all of that stuff. But I think the interesting thing is that if you frame it that way, it's very simple. What do people do? Why do they do it? And how do we get them to do it differently? But that simplicity is almost deceptive, where the reasons people do things are not all kind of internal to them. They're not just stuff that's being generated in your own brain and leading to a decision. And so we tend to have this quite kind of atomized view of individualistic decisions that all add up, and if only we could get everybody to think differently or be less selfish or be motivated by different things, whatever it might be. But the vast majority of behavioural science, and particularly the evidence on what actually works to change behaviour, is not individualistic at all. It's about the wider forces in society and culture, that come to bear on our lives, and the way that those sort of buffet us and make us choose different things than we might do if we were just in a much more neutral setting or left to our own devices.
And what are those wider forces? Do you mean things like government?
Yeah, so I suppose there's structural, but the forces themselves, I'm thinking more things like you've got what you might call sort of rational drivers, so things like economic incentives that obviously change our decisions in meaningful ways. You've got sort of social drivers, so things like what other people are doing, what society considers to be normal and legitimised. People are trying often in their decisions what you're seeing when decisions go wrong. People just desperately trying to avoid transgression at any cost. So I'm thinking those sorts of things when I talk about the forces that buffet us, but the producers of those forces are organisations like government, our employers, our jobs, our social networks. So all these different kinds of institutions, whether formal or not, that really change the way that the world looks to us and the way that we experience it.
Tell me a bit about Nesta and what it does, because that's where you are currently.
So Nesta is a really interesting place to work, particularly if you're someone like me that finds pretty much anything interesting. It's got quite a broad overarching mission. So it's to do innovation for social good. And we kind of funnel that or focus that in three ways. So we have a program of work on early years and trying to reduce early childhood inequality. We have a program of work on healthy life expectancy, and that's particularly around diet and improving food environments so that people can access to better food choices, make better choices, and ultimately kind of reduce obesity and associated life-limiting conditions. And then the third is around domestic decarbonisation, so a sort of particular focus on sustainability. And then the way that we work across those three areas is that we apply a whole range of different, what we call innovation methods. So those are things like data science and design and behavioural science and experimentation. We've got an arts and culture practice, so we look at what are the stories that are told about diet culture or early childhood and parenthood, or what generates a big carbon footprint in your house and how can you retell those stories so that people have different narratives that they can kind of draw on. So it's a big cocktail of lots of different things that we think mixed together can make a really big difference.
Tell me about early childhood first, and I presume it's ensuring that babies and toddlers have a fairer and perhaps more equitable start in life. What kind of work have you been doing on early childhood?
Yeah, so it's exactly that. It's that you see again and again, not just in the UK, but it's particularly bad in the UK, that the material circumstances of your birth, so basically how wealthy your parents are, is the biggest predictor of whether you're hitting your developmental milestones and whether at age 5 you're kind of ready to be in school. And there are lots of other things that obviously can determine that, but this one is absolutely enormous, and there's no evidence to suggest that it's kind of anything other than the kind of opportunity that you're being given. And so there's a few different things that go into that. You can imagine it's quite a complex picture. Very fundamentally, if you don't have as much material resource as another family, then you're not going to be able to invest in setting up a great, what we call a home learning environment. So as a parent, you're your child's first teacher, your home is their first kind of classroom. You can buy nice sensory toys or whatever it might be if you've got money, and if you can't do that. So there's just a very fundamental, what if people actually had more money, would that make a difference? So quite a lot of our work is on trying to quantify what the economic costs of not investing in early childhood are, what the economic benefits of investing more would be, and then figuring out what's the right way to make that investment. Is it through increasing benefits, through direct cash transfers to families? Is it through investing more in formal childcare? Then there's a whole bunch of stuff on kind of parenting as a skill. So this is not dependent on your resource. Although I suppose it is in a way where you get to the end of your tether, and if you've got enough money to go to a soft play and kill the afternoon there, then you can kind of throw money at the problem and solve it that way. And if you don't have that, then you have to be kind of on your best parenting game all day, every day. There's really well-evidenced programs about that people can go through on how to parent more effectively, how to deal with tantrums, how to manage small people, etc. But the kind of selection of those, the sort of supply of them, I guess, is quite hit and miss. So some local authorities will do them, for example, some won't. People don't know about them. People don't know that they work. So there's a whole kind of set of projects that we're doing around getting great parenting advice to people in a much kind of lower burden way. And then the last thing is around sort of quality childcare provision. So generally great to send your child to a professional childcare setting, but there are lots of things that nurseries and childminders and others can do. And then the third thing is childcare provision itself. So we do have a childcare sector. It's in quite a sorry state in the UK at the moment. So we've got massive workforce gaps. So we need to recruit many more people into the sector. It's not particularly well paid, which means that it's competitive with things like retail and hospitality jobs rather than being competitive with other education jobs, for example. So people may be less likely to go into it and more likely to want to go into something like teaching, for instance. Obviously, you don't want them competing against each other, but there's a whole set of questions that you can use these various approaches that we have to answer around how do you get more people into the workforce? How do you get higher quality provision once they're in there? How do you make sure that classrooms are really well run in nurseries, for example?
It must be really difficult to come up with the solutions because, say, for example, you're looking at the income-driven gaps in early childhood. If more money's provided, there'll be some families who will embrace that and use that for what it's designed for, to perhaps buy the more stimulating toys or a better learning environment, but other people might use it for different things. So it's very difficult, isn't it, to find a one-fit solution?
Yeah, and I think this is always the main difficulty on giving people more money directly is the fact there's not that much money, right? So that's the key challenge. But then once you overcome that, you do have these questions of what are people going to spend it on? But where there has been direct transfer of money to families in other countries, in other settings, the evidence pretty overwhelmingly suggests that they do spend it on investing more in their children. And so, of course, you're going to get some people that will put it all on red or whatever it might be, but it's pretty unusual and it's generally an investment kind of pretty well made. But you're right, it's a really tricky area.
There's some great resources out there. You've probably come across my great friend Kate Silverton's book, There's No Such Thing as Naughty. I think that's been a lot of parents' manual. She's just brought out a second book, There's Still No Such Thing as Naughty, to help with those early years. And she works with the Princess of Wales on the early years campaign. But also for the podcast recently, I interviewed the CEO of UNICEF UK just a few episodes ago, John Sparks, who was talking about getting it right in early childhood reduces the chance of lots of other things, of being vulnerable to many issues later in life, including poor mental health and homelessness. So it really is a critical area, isn't it, that you're looking at Nesta?
Yeah, and I think it's sort of the most inspiring area in some ways, in that everybody wants to help young kids have better outcomes. The least kind of exciting in others, and I think one of the big things we're trying to do is put it on the table as an economic issue, because people really underestimate the fact that if you invest in early childhood, you will reap the benefits later on. You will be paying less in unemployment. You will be collecting more in tax revenues. You'll be paying less in the prison system. And it feels almost wrong to be really focused on quantification in that way, because surely you should just want to do it because it's the right thing to do and we shouldn't be letting babies and toddlers down. But actually, if you want to get attention, you've got to speak the language of kind of economics and government, and that's really how you do it.
Because, of course, another big topic, you've been studying healthy life expectancy. And as a nation, I think, Elspeth, we do suffer a lot of ill health these days, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, the stat that always blows my mind on this is that, again, there's a really strong income gradient on it. So if you're in the poorest decile of society, you can expect to live ill health 20 years longer than someone who's in the richest decile of society. And the life expectancy gap itself is over 9 years. I can't remember if it's closer to 10 or not, but it's about 9 years between the richest and poorest. And it just seems completely ludicrous that you could have a baby born in a city, Glasgow, and a baby born in Kensington, and the difference in their trajectories just because of the money that came with their birth is absolutely wild in a developed country.
And are you looking at food as well, and obesity, and how to perhaps help people make better choices and healthier choices, which often do come with a higher price tag? Everybody will be shouting at me now that you can still buy carrots and veg at a market. But when you're on a low income, often those processed food dishes work out cheaper than trying to cook something from scratch.
Some data suggests that there's no reason that healthy food needs to be more expensive than unhealthy food. It's just the way that the sort of current economic incentives work. But there are things like, if you take it back to if you've got young children, for example, I've got 2 preschoolers. They're fussy eaters, as many preschoolers are. If I don't have enough money to buy them a backup meal as well, I'm not going to cook them some new thing they've never eaten with fresh vegetables, because they might go to bed hungry because they won't eat it. So I'm just going to give them chicken nuggets again, because I know they'll definitely eat that. So it's not just the kind of raw price of food, it's the kind of can you afford for it to go to waste or to not use it? The really interesting thing about this particular focus for us is that the mental model we have as a society about obesity is basically completely wrong. It's kind of counter to the evidence. So we think that in order to lose weight, it's all about individual willpower. So I've got to say, right, I'm going to go on this diet and I'm going to be really strict. It's normally a crash diet. So it's something that you do very quickly and you try and drop. It's sort of 6 weeks to drop however many stone or whatever it might be. And it's something that is all about your kind of individual choices. But the reality is that all of the evidence about what drives obesity and what drives poor diets is that it's not conscious, deliberate decisions that we're making. It's the kind of slow creep of higher energy density foods, more processed food, more high fat, salt and sugar food onto our shelves. So we're not noticing that the thing that we were eating 10 years ago has increased in energy density and sugar content and all of those things in order to drive the price down. So it's not a conscious change in decisions. It's, as I've just implied, it's a very long-term thing. So if we could halve obesity in the UK, that would take us back to the weight distribution of the population in the early 90s. So it sounds massive to halve obesity, but we've got it in living memory. It's just that since that time, the stuff on our shelves has become worse and worse, and we've continued to eat in roughly the same ways. And it's not just that, it's the availability as well. So now you can get food delivered to your house at the click of a button, or you can go to a 24-hour supermarket. And all of those things which have changed our food environment in subtle ways that you don't notice over time, but that have a big effect. And so actually the solution isn't how do we get everybody to do crash diets and how do we get everybody to deliberately make different choices and how do we teach people how to cook meals using healthier ingredients. It's how do we kind of pare back the worst parts of that food environment so that over time we'll lose weight in the exact same way that over time we've gained it.
And does that involve then talking to food manufacturers as well, Elspeth?
Yeah, so reformulation's a big aspect of it, reformulation and portion size. So we've done, just to give you maybe a really concrete example, so we have a couple of massive data sets that we use which describe essentially what people in the UK buy, and therefore we can deduce from that what they consume. So one of these data sets is about retail, it's about supermarkets. And then we've got a whole lot of other data sets that's much more fragmented, but about the out-of-home sector, so what people eat in restaurants, takeaways, coffee shops, and all those things. And what we've been able to do with the retailer data set is to say, what is it that people buy lots of that is quite calorie dense and that could be reformulated based on the ingredients in it. So you can take this data science approach and essentially come up with a kind of hit list of top 10 foods that you would want to get reformulated. And the good thing about reformulation is that generally people can't taste the difference between a reformulated product and the original, or if they can taste the difference, they don't sacrifice any enjoyment. It's not like they're saying, oh, this new thing's disgusting. It might be a little bit different, but it tastes just as good to them. It sounds really obvious when you kind of explain it like that, but there's a couple of things that are quite novel about it. So one is it's not really in the interests or kind of skill sets of anyone else to look at the data this way. So if you're a supermarket, it's not really in your interests to care too much. If it's not affecting your bottom line, then why would you bother looking at it? If you're a government, perhaps you don't have the data science resource sitting around to be able to go and look at something in this way. So it's kind of a new way of looking at information that we've already had. And then from a kind of public health perspective, I think a more classic approach would be to start with what foods are bad. So you'd say, which are the worst foods and can we reformulate those? But with quite little regard for the extent to which people are actually eating them. So you might end up reformulating something that's really not contributing that much to diets. And I guess the other thing I should have said to quantify this is that when I talk about small changes over time, it really is quite small. So it's taking about 8.5% of calories out of people's diets every day, which is about 216 calories. It's maybe the same as not drinking a pint or something. So it's just these small changes that sustain over time, and reformulation is a really good way of getting at that.
Two questions spring out from that. What kind of things would be on the top 10 of dishes or items that could be reformulated? And are food manufacturers willing to reformulate?
I guess one thing to say about reformulation is that it happens all the time. So it happens for a whole bunch of reasons. A lot of times the reformulation is what's leading to the problem. So a manufacturer will figure out that they can substitute one ingredient for another, and that's cheaper, and they'll do it that way. But cheaper doesn't necessarily mean healthier. or there's something that goes wrong in a supply chain and suddenly you need to source an ingredient from somewhere else, and that leads to a kind of reformulation of the product. So it's not something that they are either fundamentally against or not kind of skilled and adept at doing. It's just doing it in service of being healthier is not kind of naturally baked into current incentives. So that's the other thing we're doing, is we take these insights and then we say, okay, if government's role is to create the incentive structures that correct for some of the worst forces in the market, so constantly trying to get to the cheapest thing means that you're also constantly trying to get to the most unhealthy thing, then what can government do to kind of regulate and introduce incentives that make healthiness important? But then to your question on what's on the list, it's sort of things that you would expect. So it's like cakes and pastries, specifically it's ambient cakes and pastries, chocolate confectionery, biscuits, morning goods, which I think are things like crumpets, salad condiments, crisps. So there's a whole bunch of chilled ready meals, things on there that you would probably expect to be on the list that could readily be reformulated.
So interesting. And then, of course, the other big thing, the third big thing, is reducing domestic emissions, hopefully to net zero, presumably.
Yeah, so it's a slightly wonky goal on this one. So it's to reduce domestic emissions by 30% against the 2019 baseline, which means nothing. But all of these goals are sort of set at what do we think is a very stretching, we're unlikely to hit it, but not totally impossible target. So they're kind of what we'd call moonshot goals. It's a bit of a misconception where if you say to people, what do you think you can do in your house to reduce emissions? They'll typically give you answers like, well, we recycle and we've put in those less energy intensive bulbs, and I've got a weird like gizmo in my toilet that stops the water filling up as much. And nobody ever mentions the fact that their heating is basically the biggest problem that their house has. So if you've got a gas boiler, that's going to be pumping out most of your carbon emissions as a household. So the whole mission really is focused on, can we get people to substitute away from fossil fuel heating systems, so adopt things like heat pump and other technologies. And again, we're applying all of those different methods that I talked about to make them more appealing to people, to get people's awareness raised, to figure out how to make it much less of a faff to install these products in the first place.
Gosh, what a day's work you do when you're at Nesta, Elspeth, looking at all these massive issues. Your latest book came out earlier this year and is all about decision making. Just wondered what prompted you to make the decision to write the book on decision making.
I study decision making for a living, essentially, so it's something I know a lot about. I think the idea for the book had maybe been in my mind for about 6 years before I sat down and wrote a kind of pitch outline for it. And it must have just been slowly kind of developing in that time. But the actual impetus for doing it was probably quite ill-advised. It was 2 weeks before I was due to go on maternity leave with my second child. And I just got it into my head that a good thing to do on maternity leave would be to write this book. And I had this clause with my publisher from the first book I'd written, which was that they had first right of refusal on my next book idea. So I was like, great, here's something they can refuse if they want to, and wrote it up and sent it over. And they were like, well, the most obvious timing for doing it, but sure, okay. That's where the kind of burning platform was, I suppose.
Oh my goodness. And was it a bit of a jiggle if you're about to have your second baby?
Yeah, I would say, wouldn't recommend to anybody to do that. It's not actually the 1 year of downtime you think it's going to be, particularly when there's two of them.
No, it certainly isn't. Now, you called it Decisionscape. What is a Decisionscape?
So it uses this idea of how thinking like an artist can improve our decision making. And the Decisionscape is this sort of central metaphor where you can think of your decisions like an artist's canvas. So it's almost this kind of blank page that you can plot the various different factors that are involved in your decision on, and then you can kind of move them around. You can say what's in the foreground, what should be in the background. Have I sized things appropriately? Is my eye being drawn to something that's sort of urgent and loud and immediate but isn't actually important in this decision? And then I kind of play around with various different aspects of that metaphor of how an artist creates a canvas throughout the course of the book to really unpack what this Decisionscape idea is.
And where did that art analogy, if you like, come from?
It wasn't the core analogy in the book for a really long time. It came quite late in the process. And I can't actually remember where the first aha moment of maybe this would work as an organising principle came from. But I think the main thing that really hooked me on it was the sort of weird quest that we went on to figure out how to do linear perspective in art. So linear perspective is just creating the illusion of depth on a page. So, an 8-year-old can do it. It's kind of, if you draw a road or railway lines or something, you have your vanishing point and you have your parallel lines all sort of receding and meeting there. It's extremely straightforward, but we only figured out how to do it in the Italian Renaissance, and we've been drawing the world around us for tens of thousands of years. So it's really quite, it just seemed quite baffling as to how it took so long. And it's not really that baffling at all, because it's easy to recreate linear perspective once you know how to do it, once someone else has codified it. But doing it the first time, it's, quite the geometric feat. So there was a little bit of they had to just suss out the maths of how to do it. But even that happens. The ancient Greeks, basically, Euclid kind of cracked most of the maths for it, and then it still took centuries for it to happen. But it's also because the function of art for most of human history wasn't really around realism at all. So we think of realism as almost like this neutral kind of value-free thing, where it's of course, the point of art is to document the world around us in a really high fidelity way. And it's not, it's just a kind of reflection of our value system. And what's most interesting about it is that in the Italian Renaissance, kind of the age of science, the age of discovery, therefore they're obsessed with the rational, the real, moving out of only using art to show gods and kings. So suddenly they want cityscapes and ships and things like that. And so there's all of these reasons that people start craving realism. But in parallel, in China, there was a different system of perspective projection that emerged. It's called parallel projection. It's used in engineering drawing a lot. And the idea is that it can show you more than any individual human eye can see. So it's not a hyper-realistic view of the world, but it does still give you an illusion of depth. And there was this thing where all of the artists from Europe found out about this Chinese art. And they're like, how weird that they don't understand how to do perspective properly. And that's not the right interpretation at all. It's that the Chinese artists were like, how weird that you would want to use art to exactly reflect what you can see when the world is so much more than that.
Gosh, that's fascinating. And you've broken it down into 4 pillars of perspective, haven't you, that make a Decisionscape?
Yeah, so I've got distance and diminution is the first one. So that's what I've already kind of talked about, with sizing things according to where they are in the foreground or in the background. And an artist will have a really clear geometric code for how they do that. But in psychology, one of the most predictable things that we get wrong in decision making is what we call sort of discounting things that are distant or in the future. So if something is happening in the future, we treat it as though it's completely irrelevant to the decision, even if it's definitely going to come and bite us later. We treat things in the sort of near future basically the same as things that 1,000 years in the future. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but we're not doing a good job of sizing things at a distance proportionally. And then on the flip side of that, we let things that are immediate kind of blot out absolutely everything else. They kind of loom so large in the foreground that we can't handle them. The whole decision gets swayed by that. So that's the first bit. Second bit's about viewpoint. So the idea that when we make a decision, we underestimate how much of it is coloured by who we are, the lenses that we put on the world, where we're standing, how we're looking at something. And by looking at things from different angles, different perspectives, you can quite often see where your blind spots are. If an artist was creating a work of art, they would be really deliberate about that. There would be a particular, not just a particular place that the eye is drawn to in the picture, but even the sort of hanging instructions for the gallery would be, this is where you should hang it because of where we think eye level will be. Then the third bit is about composition. So the idea of the interplay between the whole picture and its sort of detailed parts. An artist will be really deliberate about this. They will often deliberately contrast those two things. So you might get whole styles of impressionism, for example, where you step back and you can sort of see what you're looking at, but up close it's just a load of kind of big fat brush strokes and you can't really tell what's going on in the detail. And when we make decisions, again, we're not deliberate about that. We might really tunnel in and get quite myopic about a particular detail of a decision and then completely fail to zoom out, or zoom out and think that the conclusion we drew around that one detail is going to hold for the whole thing. And then we end up being surprised when the two aren't congruent with each other. And then the last bit is about what I call the frame. So it's basically the idea of what is and is not included in the Decisionscape. So an artist, to an extent, will be deliberate about what's their subject, what are they putting into the picture, but also there might be some non-conscious aspects of that where an artist may not realise how much they're being swayed by what the style of the time is or what it's conventional to centre and focus on. And we're the same in our decisions, where we quite often bound decisions in a way that's unhelpful. So the way I sort of like to think about this is if I'm saying to my kids, I wouldn't say to them, do you want a bath? Because obviously they're going to say, no, I don't want a bath. And then we're going to end up in a battle over bath time. So I'll say to them, do you want bubbles or no bubbles? And then they end up in a very opinionated debate over whether there's going to be bubbles or no bubbles in the bath. But at no point has it occurred to them that the bath is optional. That's imposing a frame on their decisions. But we as adults have frames on every single one of our decisions. And if we could only kind of recognise what it is that we're assuming is out of bounds, we might find that there's a third way a lot of the time.
It's got to be bubbles, I'd say. And I wish I'd known that trick when mine were little. How can we use this, Elspeth, to empower ourselves and to maybe help us navigate life's complexities more than just the bath, which is also very important, obviously, when you've got young ones, and perhaps improve the choices that we make?
Yeah, I think there's sort of probably small tactical versions of it and then big kind of blow your life up versions of it. So I'll start with the sort of small tactical ones. I guess a key insight from behavioural science and that informs the book is that you're really fighting a losing battle if you're trying to rewire a human and their habits and what they do and get them to make different choices deliberately. So most of the time, people are pretty kind of set in their ways. And if you want them to change their ways, you need to change the processes that they're experiencing or the environment that they're in. Because we're not set in our ways because we think they're great and we're committed to them at all costs. We're set in our ways because we're just very susceptible to environmental forces. Charitable giving is a good example where lots of people will say, oh yeah, I wish I'd given more to charity this year. If you say to them, how much do you intend to give to charity? And then how much did you actually give? There's normally quite a big gap between their sort of intention and their action. And it's because we're just not thinking about it very often. But if you can do something like enroll in Give As You Earn, which a lot of workplaces do, then you've automated it. You never have to think about it again. You're sort of doing tax efficient giving to charity every time you get a paycheck. So what are the equivalent things like that where you can just make it that much easier for yourself? Or people will have things like, if you want to go to the gym in the morning, the extreme version is go to bed in your running gear so that you're wearing it when you wake up. But the slightly less extreme version is, you know, put it next to your bed so that you've just limited the number of choices you have to make in order to make the right one. And you've removed the friction. So that there's sort of looking at what is it that you don't do that you wish you were doing, and how might you rig the odds in your favour by changing all of the things that prompt you to do something you don't want to. I'm just always struck by, and particularly when I was researching the book, just how many things that we live our lives by are completely made up, and we could just reimagine them or ignore them if we wanted to. There's a bit in the book about time and our kind of relationship to clock time, at least, like the made-up version of time where we've said there are 24 hours in a day and we will start all of our meetings on the hour and everybody will go to work at 9 a.m. and it'll be horrible because the tube will be completely rammed and you won't be able to get in the lift at work because everybody's meeting is changing at the same time, but like, damn it, we're sticking to it. Those are sort of trivial examples, but there are all of these, interesting examples of where even quite big decisions, we end up making them differently just based on the fact that we like round numbers or we want to retire in a year ending in 0, for example, or even people kind of rig when their baby is born so that they can avoid Friday the 13th or things like this. And if we just decided to sort of unsubscribe from those collective delusions, we might live quite differently. We might not buy into things that drive us that none of us really care about.
I think those small habitual decisions that you talked about first sound like they can really have a positive impact, shaping our lives. But also, can our everyday choices impact long-term happiness as well, Elspeth?
Yeah, I think absolutely, because I think there's a lot of, how you spend your days is how you spend your life kind of expressions around this stuff, which seem quite twee, but I think are completely bang on, where a lot of the repeat choices we're making are kind of adding up to longer term health and wealth and happiness and who we are and how we experience things.
I think it's so important to try and get our things right in life. And I know you're a fan of the Oliver Burkeman 4,000 Weeks book, which I've got to admit, I haven't dared pick up because to me, 4,000 weeks doesn't sound very long, actually. Have you read his book?
Yeah, and I think the thing I like about it, I've got a bit about this in the book, there's this thing called construal level in decision making, which is essentially a sort of fancy way of describing how abstract our thinking is. So if something has a high construal level, then it's quite abstract. So maybe if you're in creative brainstorming mode, or if you're setting a strategy or a vision for a business that you might make, you want to be in a kind of high construal level mode because you want to be sort of free and able to sort of jump between big ideas easily. But if you're having to plan the budget for next year or having to figure out the exact delivery details of how to get your product to your customer or something else that requires like very concrete thinking, then you want to be in low construal level mode. And quite often we end up in the wrong mode for the type of problem that we're trying to solve. And so we end up not thinking through things in enough detail because we've been in high construal mode when we were sort of going over them, or we end up down in the details when actually we should have been looking up at the big picture. And I think the 4,000 weeks thing is a really good way of basically flipping people's construal level about time, because if you look at the span of a life, it's so long and so hard for us to get a grip on that we have to be in high construal mode on it because we just can't sort of deal with it otherwise. And if we did, we'd kind of fall over in grief every 2 seconds. It's quite a clever kind of design of the brain, if you want to think of it like that we can't actually grasp the sort of length of a human lifetime terribly easily, because if we could, it would be devastating. But the 4,000 weeks thing really flips you onto like, oh God, a week is a unit of time that I understand very well. And I know how much can get done in a week and think about it in a very granular way. And when you put it in that language, it makes me give myself a little bit of a kick up the backside.
So maybe I should read it then.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I don't know if the existential dread is worth it, but it's very good.
That's the bit I was worrying about. Now, you did have to make decisions on what went in and what got cut out of the book. And I was quite interested when I was busy researching you, Elspeth, to find out that you'd got a whole section on the post office scandal that didn't make the cut. And of course, then obviously there was the big documentary. But what were you talking about in the decision book about the post office scandal that, of course, the nation's been following really intently now?
Terrible judgment to have not included it. And I didn't include it because I thought it was too boring. And now I'm thinking a bit cynical, but would have been a great marketing hook. It was kind of an example of how when you get lots of people operating in an organisation, things can happen that no individual person would have endorsed or actively made a decision to do. And you get this sort of sleepwalking effect where there's a Wizard of Oz effect and the institution just sort of takes over and stuff happens. And the particular example was around seeing patterns where there aren't any. So it was just sort of examining the fact that this thing could have happened where a mistake in a system meant that hundreds of post offices across the country were coming in off budget. And rather than people looking at that data and going, isn't it interesting that exactly corresponds with when we implemented the new system? This has never been a problem before, and it would be extremely unlikely that you would see that degree of coordinated activity across a number of people who probably don't know each other. Instead of thinking that, people looked at it and they went, yeah, well, we've been told that this is a coordinated scam that all of these postmasters are enacting, so it must be evidence of criminal activity. It's just kind of about how motivated reasoning happens. If you're expecting to see something, you'll see it. When there are large groups of people, you become particularly vulnerable to that because nobody is acting as the kind of critical reasoning function.
Does that take us to your gorilla on TikTok and your radiologists when we're talking about not seeing things that are perhaps staring us in the face sometimes?
Yeah, so I've got this video about an invisible gorilla experiment. So many people will know about the original invisible gorilla experiment, but many may not. So the invisible gorilla originally is a short video where you're told to watch two teams throwing a basketball around. One team is dressed in black, one team is dressed in white, and you're told to count the number of times that the team wearing black, the number of passes that they make. And everybody counts, and at the end they say how many passes, and everyone's like 13 passes, and they feel really smug. And then the researcher says, right, but did you notice the gorilla walk through the middle of them? And rewinds the video, and lo and behold, there's a giant gorilla, a person in a gorilla suit that's just walked through the middle, beaten their chest and walked off. And people are absolutely gobsmacked that they didn't notice the gorilla. And the study that I was talking about is a spin on this, where the researchers took some radiologists and they showed them lung scans and they said, count the number of nodules that you see on these lung scans. And then on the last sort of slide that they're shown on the lung scan, there's a giant gorilla right over the lung. And most of the radiologists just completely failed to notice. And it's called inattentional blindness. So it basically just tells us that our attention is a sort of quite limited beam and we only see things that we're looking for a lot of the time. And I think that's exactly right. I think the post office scandal probably is an example, or part of it at least is an example of something like that. But it really is quite a shocking thing to realise that so much of our lives we're just completely missing information because we're not looking out for it. So what's really interesting is that when I put this video on TikTok, tons of people started commenting and saying, I always see the gorilla because I've got autism or because I've got ADHD. And I was like, this is weird that like a few comments and you think, well, put something on TikTok and eventually every comment you could possibly get, you'll get. But this comment was coming up again and again. And so I looked into it. And it turns out that there's research on this and that people who are neurodivergent are much more likely to see the gorilla. The hypothesis is that it's because your attention isn't kind of funneled and split in the same way. And so a lot of the kind of quote unquote problems that neurodivergent people might have stem from the fact that they don't know intuitively what they should be paying attention to. And so the attention kind of ends up getting split. And if you're paying attention to everything, you're kind of paying attention to nothing. I just thought it was really fascinating that it's like, well, you do need people that are going to spot gorillas. So it's sort of interesting that we've designed a society that completely disables a lot of people who have this ability.
I think sometimes I have friends who are neurodivergent and sometimes they see that as a blessing and a curse, but also feel that in some ways they've got superpowers. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, because sometimes thinking out of the box and thinking a little bit differently and from a different perspective is a superpower, I think.
Yeah.
Your other book is about behavioural insights. And how can behavioural insights help businesses perhaps make better decisions, governments make more effective policies?
Behavioural insights is this, so I used to work at an organisation called the Behavioural Insights Team, and it sort of came about a little bit as a term to bundle together a lot of these different fields of research around human behaviour. It didn't have a kind of particular attachment to economics or psychology or any of those other fields, so it was quite a good neutral term. But over time, I think it's come to mean the application of those insights from academia. And it's really about looking at systems, problems, government policies, business ideas through the lens of how would an actual human being interact with this, rather than through the lenses we often look at. So most of my background is in government, but a lot of the time, very understandably, if you're introducing a new policy in government, that policy is going to be disproportionately shaped by what's politically palatable, what's economically affordable, what the opening hours of the service that you're going to be delivering this policy through are, various, all of these other sort of quite practical aspects. And you can quite easily end up just completely losing sight of, hang on a minute, real human beings are going to have to interact with this. So what's going to work best for them? I mean, things like service opening hours are a really good example, where you often end up with these things where people are like, I'd love to go to that, but it's the exact same hours I'm working, or it's not compatible with school holidays, or whatever other things people have in their lives that dictate how they can and can't use their time. We need to be sort of recognizing those and designing around them. Anybody that's working with humans, whether it's selling them products or providing them with government services, should be looking through the lens of behavioural insights to figure out what's likely to work better for people.
I know you spent a decade, I think, as part of the Behavioural Insights team and some of that time in the Cabinet Office. How did you find that experience working at the heart of politics? And did you feel that you could see some of your input making a positive difference? Because we do tend to use words, don't we, when we're talking about the country and we talk about poverty, but then what is poverty? And are people actually thinking about what that means for individuals and how it looks in somebody's home?
One of the most rewarding things about the job is that you would see the things that you'd kind of dreamed up making people's lives better. It's a very sort of practical approach to policy making. So a lot of the time there's a big disconnect in traditional policy making, at least, where a minister will have an idea for something, they'll instruct the civil service to go and execute it. That'll mostly happen in Whitehall, where someone's sort of sitting at a desk and they're crunching numbers through a spreadsheet and writing up a long document saying, here's how we're going to do it. And then it gets rolled out to whatever the delivery level is, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that we would approach things from a behavioural insights perspective is to start with, okay, fine, you've got the idea of the thing that's going to be implemented, but can we go and talk to real people that need this service or would benefit from this policy and figure out what is it that we should be, what problems do they have that we should be solving? What are the needs that they have that we can try and meet? And therefore, how does that alter the design constraints on what you're actually going to end up rolling out? And then we would design either a new way of doing things compared to the status quo, or a completely different service if it was something new altogether. We'd also kind of make sure that was informed by previous research. So we already, in the behavioural sciences, have so much evidence about what does and doesn't work for people. So can we bring that evidence into the design of policies and services? And then we would run essentially massive experiments, which sounds very Machiavellian, but by that I literally just mean testing different ways of doing things to say which one seems to work better. So one example very early on in the behavioural insights team was testing letters to people who hadn't paid their tax, different versions of those letters to see which one got people to pay up sooner. And then once you've figured out which one seems to work more effectively, then rolling that out. And it does mean it's really great. So I worked on the process that people who are unemployed go through at a job centre, and it changed quite dramatically and ended up, we got good evidence that it worked more effectively. People were getting back into work faster. The advisors preferred it. It felt like a more human process overall. And then it got rolled out nationally. So that was a very rewarding thing to see.
I bet it was. You've got a really fascinating life and career, Elspeth. Tess, our astronaut selector, was correct. What is the biggest risk you've ever taken in life?
You told me you were going to ask this question, and I thought, God, I wish I'd not taken more risks because I don't have a very interesting answer. I think the biggest risk I took was moving to America for 3 years, which felt like a really big, should I do this, scary decision at the time. And I have never regretted anything less. It was brilliant. It was a really great experience for me and something that I'm really pleased that I did. But there are lots of scenarios where I might not have done that had I been more risk averse.
You set up and led the North American office, didn't you, for the Behavioural Insights team, which must have been just a really challenging and really interesting being based there.
Yeah, it was really good. One of our big kind of flagship contracts was funding to go and work with mid-sized US cities. So the idea is that if you're Chicago or New York or LA or whatever, then you can probably afford your own data nerds or behavioural research people. But if you're Louisville, Kentucky, then you probably can't. So I got to go and spend lots of time in places that I probably wouldn't go on holiday, and I had an absolute blast doing it.
Fantastic. And I can't let you go just without asking you briefly. I was going to steal a little bit of this clip from TikTok if it's okay, but one of my favourite stories of you on socials is the story behind you speaking rather unexpectedly.
People can look for my longer version on TikTok. The very brief version is my boss was invited to go to lunch at the UN. He said Elspeth will go instead. They said, no, thank you, it's not a transferable invite. He was like, no, I insist. And they said, fine, okay. I got to this lunch. It was very high level. There were lots of very important people there. And halfway through, they said, great, and now we'll hear from some speakers. I was like, that's interesting. And they said, Elspeth Kirkman's going to come up and deliver 7 to 8 minutes of prepared remarks on the role of behavioural science in relation to Sustainable Development Goal 12. Elspeth Kirkman was not prepared for this. I don't know what I said. That's the thing that's so distressing, is people are like, what did you say? And I'm like, no, I don't know. And people go, oh, no, I know, but you must actually know. And no, I truly, truly dissociated. I don't know.
Oh my goodness. I'm sure you did make sense, but I can completely understand how you probably can't even remember what you suddenly came up with. But it's one for the grandkids, eh?
It is, yeah. The only thing I do clearly remember is at one point I remember sort of tuning in on myself and thinking, why am I standing like I'm about to take a free kick? I'd gone into this weird kind of like lunge position. So I at least looked odd, even if I sounded coherent.
It's been lovely to talk to you, Elspeth. Thank you ever so much for making the time and for coming on the Convex Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to behavioural scientist Elspeth Kirkman, Chief Programmes Officer of the innovation charity Nesta, which helps tackle some of our major social challenges. There are 180 Convex Conversations now to enjoy, all pretty timeless, so download and subscribe to our series for free at convex.podbean.com or search the Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with American cardiologist and natural heart doctor Jack Wolfson, so join me then.